Welcome back to Elevate Your Business, a podcast where we discuss proven, transformative approaches to business growth and exit strategies. Join us as we talk to successful entrepreneurs, share new and profitable ideas, and help you grow wiser and wealthier so you can experience limitless success in both life and business. Now, here's your host, Adam Koch, business transition consultant and founder of Elevate and Exit at elevateandexit.com.
What's going on, everybody? Thank you so much for joining us today. As always, let's get started with a few housekeeping items. If this is your first time listening or watching, thank you so much for joining us. The Elevate Your Business podcast is an educational show aimed at providing business owners all over the country with honest, authentic, fiduciary-driven insights to enhance their enterprise value for eventual exit. Now, the podcast is produced bi-weekly, offering straightforward advice and expert knowledge to help you navigate the complexities of business growth and transition. So be sure to subscribe on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify. You can also find us on Twitter, or X as they call it now, as well as Instagram and Facebook. And I believe we're going to be on TikTok soon, believe it or not. Much to my chagrin, I'll just say that. But of course, this is the best place to get more videos, articles, podcasts, screencasts, links, visuals, charts, everything else, elevateandexit.com. So check that out. Subscribe there as well to get invitations to live events, webinars, as well as notifications when podcasts come out, just like this one. All right, enough housekeeping. He's been on before, and I'm excited again to welcome Bob St. Germain, Managing Director and Principal at Corporate Finance Associates in Columbus, Ohio. Bob's career began with distinguished service as a U.S. Army officer and West Point graduate, where he served in leadership roles with the 82nd Airborne and Special Forces. And I believe I just heard the other day, Bob, from someone else who knows you, that you had to eat paper when you were when you were at West Point. Is that true?
That is true. There was a eating, and part of it was denial of food. So paper was part of the enterprise.
That's an incredible story. It's not even the end of it, I'm sure. But anyway, after earning his MBA from Harvard Business School, Bob transitioned into corporate finance, gaining over 2 decades of experience across major companies like Northrop Grumman and Polaroid. And now, with extensive experience in mergers, acquisitions, and business transitions, Bob helps companies in the lower middle market navigate successful exits and growth strategies. And one more thing, I believe it was 18 years ago now that Bob sat down with me for breakfast and gave me the time of day at a time when I was only 6 years in the business, when there were probably many more financial advisors and business transition experts out there that he could have been spending his time with. So thank you for that, Bob, for giving me a shot when I was young. It's an honor once again to have you on the podcast.
Very good. Thank you for the invite. For
sure. All right, let's just jump into it. You mentioned that owners, they should start planning their exit from day one. That was one of the things actually, if any of you listening or watching didn't catch it, Bob just did a presentation, actually a webinar that's also going out for replay. So you can watch that presentation as well. But one of the things he said in that webinar was that business owners should plan for their exit from day one. So can you explain why early planning is so crucial, and what specific steps a business owner should take in the early stages to ensure that they're well prepared for a future exit?
Yeah, good question. When we talked about it last week, I came back and said it might sound flippant, but it was not intended to. And the question was essentially, when should a business owner start planning their exit? And I basically said it should be from day one, after they either found the company or buy the company. Couple of reasons for it. Number one, it informs the business owner how they need to run their business during their tenure. I'll give you an example. Take a 30-year-old young woman, young man that decides to either buy or found a company, but their long-range goal, their life goal, is to retire at age 40 and then spend the rest of their life traveling the world and assuming all the expenses associated therewith. That kind of situation is going to require a very fast growth profile, running the company to really drive up value, because when the liquidity event takes place, in my scenario, 10 years later, there's got to be sufficient proceeds, net of taxes, et cetera, to sponsor that lifestyle that in my scenario, the owner wanted to do post-close. So contrast that with somebody who says, you know what, I just want a lifestyle business. enough to give my wife, my family, my kids good schooling, etc. And I'm going to retire at age 80. Different profile. And so therefore the needs and the wants, depending on that lifestyle goal or that life goal event, really drives and informs how should the business be run. The other reason, major reason, is that life happens. Despite your planning, all the best planning, health issues, death, unsolicited offers, and the like could happen along in your tenure, no matter what your original plan was. And the better prepared you are to go through that unexpected event, obviously, the better the outcome at the end of the day. And the outcome is always in terms of value. You're monetizing your life's work, whether it's that short-term scenario, the long-term scenario, a life event interceding. The better prepared you are, then obviously you're pulling more out to enjoy the rewards from your life's work. Two general reasons.
Yeah, I think, and unfortunately, the vast majority of owners don't do any planning at all, sadly. So
Exactly.
now I was just talking to an owner actually yesterday about their company valuation, and I'm sure you've never heard this before, but they didn't feel like they felt like their company was worth more than the valuation. Have you ever heard that?
All the time.
So many owners, they'll focus on EBITDA, but there's adjustments and nuance involved, obviously. So could you elaborate maybe a little bit on the, key metrics a business owner should focus on and how they can avoid common pitfalls that lead to over or undervaluating their company?
Yeah, and I think an important point to make here, there's a nuance here about EBITDA multiples. That is very commonly used, and people come away thinking that that's how businesses are valued. Actually, that is the result of the process I'll describe now. Businesses get transacted. Central reporting agencies will take in data on a blind basis from private equity groups and whatnot that contribute their data to this database. The database agent will then turn that blind data into multiples that come out of the actual purchase price. And there'd be a multiple of revenues, gross profit, EBIT, EBITDA are typical multiples that are derived therefrom. So when we're looking at an EBITDA multiple, that's an indicator of how the market is generally perceiving and valuing companies. It is not how the company is valued per se. A little nuance there, but it's important that people understand that. Buyers are going to run their own financial models. They're going to integrate their own expectations about synergies, operational improvements post-close. There's going to be a different capital stack in the company post-close than that the seller currently has. And out of that will come an offer, hopefully a close, that gets reported. And then out of that purchase price, the multiples are derived. Now, to your question about EBITDA, it is important. It's an indicator. It's often used as a starting point for people like us and you yourself, I'm assuming, to counsel your clients, our clients, on what they might expect given what the market is doing. But EBITDA, earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, amortization, scientifically found, go to a P&L. Typically EBITDA isn't there, but you can find it knowing what EBITDA is. But you can't stop there. You've got to make certain adjustments that basically account for a number of issues. Number one, any non-operating expenses or revenues that are being run through the P&L, any non-recurring expenses or revenues that are being run through the P&L, and lastly, any extraordinary compensation that's being run through the P&L. Now, some examples thereof. Non-operating expense, an example would be the fleet of cars that are owned personally by the owner, and the expenses associated therewith are run through the P&L. They're not operating assets. And in fact, therefore, those expenses become legitimate add backs on top of the EBITDA. And what you're trying to do, because it is a multiple of EBITDA, every dollar that you can legitimately add back to EBITDA has a multiple applied against it. And so therefore, it's important that you capture every add back and conversely, every negative add back as well to properly, accurately, and fairly represent your company. A non-recurring revenue, or excuse me, a non-operating revenue might be the one-time sale of a plot of land next to the facility that you own that's also on your company balance sheet. Again, it's a one-time event. It's not really part of the operating cash flow of the business. That would be subtracted out. Non-recurring would be an example of non-recurring expense. An example of that might be a insurance deductible. You had a fire in the warehouse. You had a $50,000 deductible. I'm making this up. And again, you don't have fires every year. Hopefully, it's a non-recurring expense. It's not normal, not normative. That gets added back. Extraordinary compensation, basically two components to that. How is the owner paying him or herself relative to market? At market, above market, below market, and adjustments are made accordingly based on the finding. But the other thing is that business owners will often own the real estate, the facility out of which they operate in a separate LLC, and then lease it back to the operating entity. So another item that needs to be understood is, are those lease rates at, above, or below market? So all those adjustments get made, and they're all important because, again, as the additions and subtractions take place, EBITDA is changed, if you will, accordingly, and you get the multiple against that final number. So, and then, of course, it's a multiple against that adjusted EBITDA. So one final point on that. The algorithm is essentially adjusted EBITDA times some multiple. Multiple is basically determined by the buyer, and it's a function of their perception of the likelihood that they can replicate the same cash flows or higher that the current owner is enjoying. And that comes from them. And that, I think we'll probably talk about that a little bit later, but there are a number of elements that go into their thought process that cause them to come up with a given multiple against that adjusted EBITDA.
Now, speaking of, exit strategies actually happening, there's lots of ways to do it, right? Lots of ways to skin that cat. They can sell to partners, people can sell to employees, they can sell to third parties, auctions, buyouts, mergers. Can you kind of go through some of those examples of, which make the most sense in different situations or why people pick maybe one option over another?
There are essential ways to exit a company. The first and probably the least rewarding is just close up shop, take down the signage, go fishing, sell off your assets. Basically a liquidation, and you're going to get pennies on the dollar. Some people actually do that. It's just shocking when you find that out, but they don't realize that they have an operating entity that in other people's eyes might have some value beyond or above what a liquidation would result in, but they do it anyway. They're not properly being advised. The group is selling internally to a partner, to children or family, to the management team, or to the employees. And each of those, and there's no right or wrong in any of this, but if you, in a partnership arrangement, you are typically going to have a buy-sell agreement in place. And the buy-sell agreement is going to dictate how, under a different set of circumstances or contingencies, one partner buys out the other or partner sells to the other. And it'll be dictated within that buy-sell agreement. If the buy-sell agreement is, in fact, executed or properly created, it's going to discourage sales while the enterprise is in operation, because you don't want to have the remaining partners having to come up with a lot of cash to buy out the departing partner. And so the language is typically very, very restrictive. It can be very conservative. Yeah, we'll buy you out if you want to leave, but we're going to pay you out over time. We're going to have a very conservative valuation built into the buy-sell agreement, et cetera. But hey, if that's a contingency you're faced with, then that makes sense. Selling to children or management teams, typically the negative there is there's a note, because children and or management teams typically don't have the financial wherewithal to do a full payout or full buyout of the current owner. Now that may be fine. You want to take care of the kids. You want to take care of them. Again, there's nothing wrong with it. You just need to understand as a potential seller that you're not going to get typically all your money up front, if in fact that is your goal. Not that it is always, but it's just an element to be considered. Sale to employees, an ESOP. An ESOP is a tax-advantaged plan, and so therefore the valuations tend to be naturally conservative. The government, Department of Labor in particular, will audit and take a very hard look at how the company was valued. And again, because it's tax-advantaged, they tend to look for lower valuations, not as if it was being sold on the open market to a synergistic buyer. And again, typically there is a note involved because the valuation is higher than typically the ESOP fund has monies to buy out the company. So the owner's holding a note. Again, perfectly fine if that's what you want to do and take care of your employees. The other options are an external sale. And there's basically two types of those. Initial public offering, selling to the public as the name implies, or selling to a third party. An IPO or initial public offering really requires the company, it's got to be fast growing, it's got to have a lot of sizzle, it's got to have some technology, it's got to have real demonstrable differentiation, et cetera, et cetera. So very few companies qualify for that and have those attributes and therefore qualify for an IPO. If you do, okay, fine. And that's something that needs to be considered. IPOs are expensive to go through. So nets can be damaged somewhat from that. But again, if you're the right kind of company, that's the right way to go. Most companies privately held companies in particular, will fall into selling to a third party, or what we call a leveraged buyout, or a merger and acquisition deal, or a recapitalization. And basically those terms just relate to who is the counterparty in that kind of transaction. Typically a strategic buyer or a financial buyer are the two type of counterparties. And in that case, you're basically looking for strategic buyers who have demonstrable synergies, potential synergies with you as the seller. They will typically pay a premium. In the case of financial buyers, you're looking for private equity groups or family offices that similarly have portfolio companies already in place that are in your space. And so therefore they too would begin to find some synergies and therefore a certain willingness in a competitive environment to pay a premium. So those are the ways to go. Liquidate, sell internally, sell externally. None of them are right or wrong. You just need to understand the ramifications that come with each.
Okay. Now, there's different sizes of acquisitions, right? So you worked with several, large M&A projects, and, multiples, as you mentioned earlier, do play a pretty big role in valuation. Can you maybe talk a little bit about how buyers think through these multiples, how business owners can position themselves to achieve a higher multiple on the sale of their company?
Again, buyers will start with understanding or assuming that a well-represented seller is fully aware of the multiples for their size company and for the industry in which they participate. And there's an inverse relation. Let's go back to that risk, which is the multiple. It's it's basically the buyer's assessment of risk. The higher the perceived risk, the lower the multiple. The lower the perceived risk, the higher the multiple, particularly in a competitive environment. And we'll talk about it hopefully later. So expectations around the larger the company, typically the less risk, the higher the multiple. And so if you're a business owner and you're somewhere along your tenure and you're planning the horizon, if you grow your company, you will be rewarded for it. Larger companies get higher multiples, and you really get a double bang for your buck, if you will. You're going to have typically in a larger company a higher EBITDA, a higher adjusted EBITDA. And because you're larger, you're less risky. You've got typically more market share. You've already scaled up. You're well established in your marketplace compared to a smaller company, et cetera. You're going to get a higher multiple against that higher adjusted EBITDA. And so you begin to leverage value very quickly as you grow your company. And so that's how buyers look at it. That's how sellers should look at it. And the expectation there from is you're going to get more with that higher EBITDA. The higher valuation comes from the larger size company. Premiums are also paid for better run companies. Business owners, when they're in the trenches every day and it's a question of, my goodness, how do I handle what do I have? Do I grow? Do I not grow? Do I really crank down and really bring in some outside expertise to really tighten the screws, if you will, and improve performance? Is it worth the effort? And a lot of folks will just not make the effort. And in so doing, they're leaving a lot of money on the table because they would have been rewarded for a larger enterprise, for a better run enterprise. And so I'll kind of stop there. I hope I've answered your
No, you're
question.
fine. In fact, that ties back into something we were talking about earlier, where you talk about, the one huge reason you're mentioning it now, why again, people should start doing this planning now as opposed to waiting till later, because it's going to exponentially grow the value of your company today, the enterprise value, for later. So that's going to help you in multiple ways along the way, exponentially, I think. Yeah. Next question, really, not to change gears a little bit here, but well, we talked about buyers, what they're looking for. What kind of drivers are going to influence the buyer's willingness to pay that higher multiple? Factors such as recurring revenue you talked about, management team strength, IP, intellectual property. How do these affect the valuation, and maybe other things as well?
Yeah, no, good. There's basically a pretty succinct list of things that buyers are looking for when they are looking to assess the risk associated with a company or a target company. And I think if you go down kind of a list, it really makes sense. I mean, for example, does the company have backlog or not? I mean, just think of yourself, put yourself in the shoes of a buyer. Company A has a year's worth of backlog. Company B's got 2 weeks worth of backlog. From a risk perspective, which is the higher valued company?
Right.
Think in terms of customer concentration. That's another very, very important issue. Customer concentration starts in buyers' minds when a given customer accounts for 10% or more of revenues or profits. Now you've got a large chunk of your P&L basically risked by that at risk by that one customer. So again, contrast company A with 1,000 customers and company B that's got 2. Everything else is equal. They're making the same kind of monies at the top line. They're making the same kind of monies at the bottom line, but company B is built on sand. They've only got 2 clients. They lose one or both post-close. The relationship is with the seller, not with the buyer. What's the likelihood the buyer is going to lose one or both of those? That type of company wouldn't even be saleable. So in contrast with the one with 1,000 customers, a lot higher value, a lot lower risk. You talked about intellectual property. I mean, if you have protection for your product or services in some form or fashion, copyrights, patents, whatever, contrast that with a company that does not. Well, okay, company A with the IP in place versus company B, everything else being equal, company A naturally has more value. You mentioned recurring revenues. That's an important ingredient, often taken a very, very hard look at by potential buyers. Contrast company A again with rents, royalties, maintenance contracts, long-term contracts in place, compared to company B, which is all about projects. And they get finished with a project and they're chasing the next project. Mm-hmm. Again, if a lot of your P&L has got recurring revenue flowing through it, that's like clipping coupons. You have just reduced the risk from the buyer's perspective for your company versus that company B that's continually chasing new projects. And so those are the kind of things. I think you mentioned second tier management too. That'd be the last one I'll bring to your attention, but it makes sense. I mean, if the owner is the company, owns all the customers, the only one who understands all the systems, processes, procedures, et cetera, and if he or she were to die or go away, That means that the buyer is going to have to parachute in a large team to run that company post-close. That's cost and risk beyond the purchase price of the company, if it even got sold. And so one of the things that sellers must be aware of in their planning, you got to have a strong second tier team. If you're the company, you have very low value because that becomes a very high risk proposition.
Now, speaking of the people, one aspect I think that often gets overlooked because I think so much time is spent pre-sale planning for transition and so on, are the cultural challenges that most people just don't think about. So can you talk a little bit about how business owners can make it a smooth transition culturally for their employees and management teams after the sale completes?
And I'm gonna answer by saying basically all of that needs to happen before the sale. Very often we think of the seller as a supplicant in the process. They are not. They need to think of themselves as a co-equal with the potential buyer. And part of the pre-close work they need to do is due diligence on the buyer, very similar to what the buyer due diligence is going to be on the seller. Again, it's often this supplicant role. I just need to feed the buyer. I need to make this thing happen. We say, no, you are co-equals in the process, and you need to do things like help select that buyer. You need to understand their culture. You need to meet with their principals. If they've already got some portfolio companies that they own, you need to have access to the current current management team of those portfolio companies that went through the process before you with that buyer. You need to understand how are they treated before close, how are they treated through close, and most importantly, how are they now being treated as a portfolio company post-close? That gives you some cultural indications about, is this a fit or not a fit? And a lot of good information comes out of that process. So it's kind of a bespoke, if you will, bespoke selection process when you go out to market, either yourself or you're brought to market by an investment banker. The purpose is to not only find a potential synergistic buyer, but to find one where there is, at least in theory, I mean, obviously in practice, time will tell, but at least in theory, there is also that natural cultural fit. And that can be tested pre-close. You don't want to just start experiencing it post-close and say, oh my gosh, what did I do to my employees and my team? But again, pre-close, due diligence as much as you can on the buyer. And a good, healthy buyer interested in a fair outcome will be more than happy to assist in that process, giving you access to the owners of their current companies, et cetera. So,
Yeah. Can you share maybe through your entire career, you've done this a lot, with several companies. Can you share maybe your favorite exit? I know maybe it's not a favorite, but one that you felt was maybe big, really impactful, really successful.
Yeah. I'll say everyone is a favorite because what we have done in taking a family or individuals through an exit is we have really helped them achieve their life plan. We often talk in terms of exit planning, et cetera, et cetera. I know that came up early, even in this presentation. We think of it in terms of a life plan. A business is a component of your life, a very important component of your life. Most business owners have most of their wealth tied up in their business, which is why the sale of that company or recapitalization of that company is so incredibly important. As you know very well, Adam, servicing clients who have gone through the process and helping them with their proceeds. The lost my train of thought. Tell me again
You're fine.
Favorite thought. Yeah, okay. So everyone is a favorite in that it's rewarding being able to help the families or the individuals experience that good, solid exit. But I'll tell you, there have been a couple. I'll cite one that in particular that this is a couple of years ago. We took through a process. So they were represented by CFA, by myself personally. We took them through a process, and our bespoke outreach was to strategics in their space, larger companies in their space. And the theory was that the strategics, given the very unique nature of what they did from a service perspective, would be the ones most likely to find synergies in what they offered and therefore be willing to pay a higher price. What we did, we went out to market to over 100 strategics in and around their space. We got about 40, if my memory serves me correct, got 40 indications of interest. People were really excited about
Wow.
this company. So we took them through a multiple step process, and I'm reflecting, if you will, on
Yeah.
a process versus somebody trying to sell their own company, where the first step to get indications of value or a preliminary offer is through what we call an indication of interest. They've seen the confidential information memorandum, or SIM. So they have enough information that says, okay, it's larger than a box, smaller than a house. This is how I value it. This is what I would do. This is how I finance it. This is what I would do with a management team. Maybe the real estate, if real estate comes with the deal. And then we take them through the next step of putting out a call for letters of intent. Out of the 40, we got 8 letters of intent, all solidly packed around a price X. And then we continued the process, making the phone calls around all 8, basically testing their willingness to move or not, testing their sense of is this a strategic fit? If it is, can you see this? Company A over here, a potential buyer sees it this way. And we were able to eventually cause one of those 8 to emerge from the pack. It became clear that they had such an important strategic attachment to this potential purchase. They were willing to go way into the premium range to be sure that they were the winner. And what came out of it, where we started with that cluster around X, that deal ended up at a little over 2X. So that seller enjoyed the results of a well-run process, having been brought before all of the potential premium buyers in their space, and came away with a very, very nice package.
Yeah.
Those are the deals that really strike home and are very rewarding both ways.
Yeah. I see you smile. I see you smiling a little bit. It's like that kind of jazzes you up,
Yeah.
Yeah. Not to flip the coin over here, but for the aspiring entrepreneurs out there, or people who are maybe ready and looking to go round 2 as a business owner for the second time around, can you explain maybe why acquiring an existing company is often a better option for those looking to expand or get into business ownership?
Yeah. The statistics are pretty stark. If you check in, you're going to see statistics that basically say, if you buy a start, or you start a company, within 5 years, 80% are gone. That is a rough road to hoe, and we'll talk about why, obviously. But in contrast, if you were to buy an existing company, 5 years later, 80% of those are still in existence. So stark difference between a startup and purchasing a company in that same space. And when you take a look at what you are attempting to do from a startup perspective versus buying an existing entity, and we'll make the assumption it's the same geographic area, it's the same type of company in the same industry, so everything's equal. But in one case, you're trying to start it. In the other case, you're trying to buy one that already exists. You start up a company, I mean, you've got to make a huge investment depending on what you do, and you got to take out a lease. Those are typically not short term. It's a 5-10 years lease. You got to bring in employees. You got to spend a lot of money on marketing. Depending on the type of company you are, you got to position inventory in place so it's readily available. Depending on the type of company you're running. A lot of upfront expenses go into starting an enterprise before you reach break even and start even making your $1. And you assume all the risks associated with success from a start. Now, if you've got a great idea, you are highly differentiated and confident, you can swing it in the marketplace, go for it. But understand that statistics are working against you. The failure rates are just tremendous. Now, contrast that with buying a company. And again, whether it's a individual looking to buy a company and become an entrepreneur, or it's a company in existence looking to grow by acquiring another company, the same attributes benefit both. I mean, you're buying an existing entity. You can look at existing history and current financials and cash flow. Employees are in place that are fully trained. You've got a full set of customers that hopefully have some continuing loyalty to the customer. You've got vendors already lined up. All that goes into when it comes to running a company are in place and are measurable during a due diligence process. And typically, if it passes muster in due diligence, you're acquiring a company that's already throwing off cash, has all of the goes into's, if you will, customers, employees, vendors in place, and you're ready to go from day one. So the risk is greatly mitigated in that case. Now, you're having to pay to buy the company up front, but I would argue that in contrast to paying to start a company with the inordinate amount of risk associated with it, the trade-off is worth it. Buy rather than start up.
It sounds like a no-brainer. Yeah. Well, one more kind of two-part question for you here before we wrap up. M&A advisors like you, you obviously play a key role in this process. Can you talk a little bit about why your role is so important and why it makes sense to build a team out like we so often preach, in all of our discussions with Elevate, this past 3-4 years now we've been doing this. And then lastly, what would you say is the range or minimum company size in terms of gross revenue that you would that you'd be able to help, where you can make a dent?
Yeah, I'll start with that last question. Corporate finance associate is positioned as a lower mid-market player. So typically we're dealing with companies that are generating between $10 million and $250 million in revenues annually. The sweet spot that we typically work in every year is typically between $20 and $70 million in revenues. So it kind of gives you the range. On occasion, we'll take on a smaller assignment because we're working also with private equity groups that are looking for a particular play, geographically, product-wise, whatever. So we'll take a look at anything, but our sweet spot is as I just described. Second question, why don't you repeat that?
As far as why it's so important to build a team out and not try to go it alone, essentially.
Yeah, I'll give you an example. There is a very interesting study I make reference to in last week, as a matter of fact, in our presentation. It's out on the internet. You can sort it and find it. It's a study that's been done over a number of different years, and these academic researchers have they're up to 3,000 private transactions to date, where 1,500 were completed as proprietary deals, i.e., buyer and seller came together by themselves and did a transaction. The other 1,500, or half of the surveyed companies, basically went to market with the services of an investment banker. And what they discovered was that between the two, all other things being equal, and the statistics and the what they did in terms of trying to get it down to a true comparisons by industry size, all the other metrics you might imagine, was that those companies that went to market with investment banker assistance generally enjoyed up to a 25% premium over the companies that went by themselves. Now, what's behind that? Well, what's behind that is, number one, the buyer in each case, they're sophisticated. They have got crackerjack teams on their side, already established, ready to go, been through this multiple times. They know what they're doing. They know how to transact. Typically, a business owner who's going to sell their company typically has never been through that process before. And they are babes in the woods to be taken advantage of by that or in that proprietary process. What's going to happen? You take a call from a private equity group, a strategic looking to acquire. They found you, found your company. They'll wine and dine you. They'll get you to sign a letter of intent. In that letter of intent will be a no-shop clause. So for an agreed upon period of time, 60, 90, 120 days, your company's off the market. You have no frame of reference. Their offer is the only one you will see. And yet you're left at the end having to say, do I want this offer or do I not? And you have no frame of reference. Is it a good offer? Is it a bad offer? How would you know?
It's awful.
In contrast to engaging the services of professionals to bring them out to market, where the process I made reference to earlier, where buyers are being specifically identified for characteristics that would improve the probability of a premium price, marketing documents, very robust marketing documents are created and used in communicating with those buyers. It's all done under confidentiality agreements or non-disclosure agreements. So it's always held in confidence, the information that's being put out into the marketplace. Sellers are always worried about people being aware of their company being for sale, rightfully so.
Mm-hmm.
And then taking those steps that I mentioned earlier, taking companies through an indication of interest and getting those preliminary offers, down selecting from that group to a smaller group to be encouraged to go through some further due diligence, us on them as well as them on us. And then finally, that call for letters of intent, where again, that process I made reference to earlier gives us another second shot at negotiating a higher premium than what was even offered in the LOIs that come forth. That process and those steps are denied to the seller who goes directly to or accepts a call directly from a potential buyer. They don't have the benefit of the competition, and the competition generates deal heat. Buyers really interested in the seller's company, they're going to fight hard. They want that company, and they get sharpened pencils, and as they go through the process, the premiums tend to rise. All that gets lost in the case of those proprietary deals.
It's almost like going to a big, huge, important, court case and then deciding not to show up with an attorney.
Yeah, exactly right. Exactly.
Not the hardest move in the world.
Yeah.
Well, that's going to be our time for the day, everybody. If you'd like to get a hold of Bob, you can find him on LinkedIn. As always, it's an easy way to get a hold of him. You can also reach out to him directly via email at rstgermain@cfaw.com. And you can also just check out their website, which is cfaw.com/Columbus. So there'll also be links, contact information in the show notes below. So feel free to check that out. Tune in next month. We're going to have Joseph Sophia joining us for a webinar titled Profitable Goodbyes, a masterclass on exiting your business from those who nailed it. And then as always, Joe and I will be doing a podcast together, just like we're doing here, Bob and I. So be sure to subscribe, get access to those, both the webinar and the next episode. And as I always say, there are thousands of podcasts out there. You chose to give ours a listen. So thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
We hope you enjoyed today's episode. To complete our free business valuation quiz or to set up an introduction call, just head over to elevateandexit.com. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be considered legal, financial, tax, or as a basis for investment decisions. Always consult a professional business transition planning consultant or a certified exit planning advisor before implementing any of the ideas shared in this episode.